And well, we're counting on you to make this all happen. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Our apologies. There's no woman worse shot than the shoemaker's wife. This is the launching day, and I'm very happy to see that our efforts, ever since January 2014, we launched this initiative in Catalonia with a goal to let everyone know about how the lack of proper time policies in our country was detrimental. And now we are launching this debate, probably with a slightly different viewpoint, but also so that time use policies become part of our political agenda. In Catalonia, we have had doctors, psychologists, the ecologists, the experts from the educational world, gender, and representatives of companies and institutions, people and institutions concerned about how to organize our time and our day to day. And we're doing this at a global scale. By the way, many people have acclaimed our initiative from all over the globe. We have very high ambitions. We want this idea to be a reality. We visualize that the United Nations and the EU by 2030 will probably announce that they all need to be committed from their national agendas. There's a certain paradox, maybe not, in a country with very disorderly time uses, probably one that is not balanced, let's say, in terms of how they manage time. We are now spearheading this effort. And that's why we have different speakers today to analyze this. I will give the floor to them momentarily, and I'll introduce them as we go along. First, we have Serra, who's a dear friend and a colleague from the Advisory Council for Time Use Reform in Catalonia. He's a manager at the Barcelona City Council. She's an expert in the field, and she's been fighting for this time use reform for years now. Serra, good evening. So in cities, in districts, in municipalities, that's where everything happens. We wake up, we go to bed, we go shopping, we have a drink with friends, we take a walk, we go to schools, we park our cars. So we coexist with one another, which is our most important mission. So tell us about Barcelona, how and why it has been leading this fight to change our time uses and the way we distribute time. What is this Barcelona Time Pact all about? And what have had to change regarding the current pandemic? What kind of measures have you had to change based on what you approved of 3 or 4 years ago? Thank you, Fabian. Good evening. It is a pleasure for me to be here amongst friends, colleagues, people who've been fighting for so many years to enjoy healthier time uses that are more sustainable and more efficient as well. Um, for our city, it has always been a necessity to work for healthier time use. It was the first city in Europe to have a department at the city council for new time uses. But I think we moved past that. We attempted to sign on a citywide pact with the different stakeholders in the city, which is still current. And now we decided to take a step forward, not only to show our best intentions by signing this pact, but also to start implementing actions to favor that change. You can only be a partner, let's say, a signatory of that pact, as long as you show commitment and start working to change things. If there's something that the pandemic has shown us, is the way we live our lives is not sustainable. And it has brought to bear some of the topics that we were discussing, but we had not tackled practically, such as telecommuting. There are many countries with about 30% of that kind of telework, whereas in our country it was 5%. So I do not want to attempt to explain to you what this has meant for a city council like ours, and pretty much overnight having everyone on lockdown at home and carrying out most of their city council workers' tasks from home. And obviously still responding to citizens, because we're public civil servants, and that's where citizens need it the most. So just imagine, only 200 people out of those 16,000 used to work remotely, and 4 weeks after the royal decree from the central government, we had more than 5,000. And in a couple of weeks, we had 10,000. So it was quite a challenge, quite a technological leap. Um, in and itself, this is a positive step. I'm not saying that the pandemic has been good for us, but at least it has brought an opportunity to us, and we've made the most of it, and we've found a silver lining. However, how did we do that? Well, quite hastily. We had to find ways to deliver those services to citizens, but based on a culture that favored on site work. And I have to say that this has not changed based on what I see. It is true that more than 10,000 out of those 16,000 workers can now connect remotely from home. And we hold an average of 500 interviews with 4,500 people joining uh, um, at the same time, which is extraordinary. We still have a culture based on presence, on on-site meeting, which means we haven't been extremely efficient along the way, and this is a learning opportunity. For instance, this meeting craze, this need to meet up with everyone all the time in order to make decisions. That's something that the pandemic has brought to us. The regular working hours were burst to smithereens. And for the first time, after such a crisis that was quite unheard of, after a couple of months, it was not a novelty anymore. And still, that meant we had to meet with people on Saturday or on Sunday at any time. We know that we're not productive if we've been working for longer than 8 hours, if you've been fully devoted to your work. The ability to take wrong decisions increases. We can make mistakes. Obviously, I'm sure we have made a lot of those mistakes because, as Marcel used to say, if you haven't made a mistake during this crisis, that means that you haven't had the responsibility to take decisions. But if we work day and night without unplugging from that, we're even more likelier. We're likelier to take the wrong decision. So there was a time the month of May, in which I sent an instruction to the local city council employees because it was quite chaotic, and we set up certain rules: what constituted telecommuting and what didn't, in which areas they could work remotely and in which they couldn't, what kind of breaks could be taken. So, working hours, the right to digital unplugging, mostly during the night and also most weekends, do's and don'ts, and obviously preventative measures. We had to do that because, as I was saying, if we hastened to work the way we were doing it, it brought us to a lot of inefficiencies. And as I was saying, still there was this trend to meet online and also on site, because apparently you were not good enough if you did not take part in meetings, because in our country people are not following target or tasks, but rather they believe that they need to be seen, otherwise they're not appreciated. So everyone wanted to be there, and it's a fundamental issue, and we also need to start working on it and to work on a real telecommuting program, how to organize our time.
The point is that telecommuting cannot serve to just enshrine and further ensconce gender stereotypes. We have a representative of the Spanish government here. I really believe we need to be imaginative, use our imagination, and find ways to equality in telecommuting, and find ways to balance things between men and women, because what data are telling us is that the responsibility for children's homework, for the work of for household work, and for care and supervision of children has corresponded to women to a very high percentage. And also, women have told us at the survey center we have in Catalonia that, well, women have told us, have reported that they've worked many more hours on many more aspects than they were working before the pandemic. So telecommuting cannot serve to further enshrine stereotypes. We have to find ways for telecommuting to lead to shared responsibilities, not have what the German trade unions discovered was happening when only women were doing telecommuting because they were doing it for work-life balance. Because that ultimately leads to more of a glass ceiling. If you're working from home and nobody sees you, and you're not taking part in informal meetings either, you're very unlikely to reach decision-making positions. So let's be careful about this. We also have to watch out for the digital divide, which also affects women because they're working or they are operating in the lower socioeconomic segments. But we can use telecommuting to prevent pollution and to have better quality of life. Not just better quality of life, better quality of air, a better environment, which also prevents all sorts of problems and diseases that we're dealing with. Networked leadership is one possibility. That's also something we've been doing through the pandemic, and I think it's particularly helpful in the case of telecommuting. So, with the hope of sustainability, efficiency, and health, I leave you with that's the end of my intro, and I can say a few more things later if you like. Thank you very much, Sarah. We also have Alexis Serra here. He's the director of the only uh, time use reform office in the world, aside from the ones created by certain governments. I would like Alexis to tell us about the Pact for Time Reform in Catalonia and what measures he can highlight in the present context. He can also tell us about the Objective 2025 and which particular measures he would like to highlight. And the same as I asked Sara, what did you in the government of Catalonia have to do to change your course? What adjustments did you have to make? And of course, this is my starting question, but then we can go further. Thank you very much, Fabian. Thanks to all of you who are following us. Congratulations on this seventh time use week, the seventh in Catalonia. Fabian, I will answer your questions, but first, there are a few things that it's important to say at the outset by way of reflection upon what we're experiencing today. There are just 4 points. One, aside from the negative impact of the pandemic, which negative in all sorts of spheres, including the personal sphere, um, many of us have experienced this in many ways. Aside from the negative side of things, the pandemic is giving us an opportunity to live differently. That's my first point. Second point, the current time in Catalonia and all over the state of Spain is unsustainable already. Third point, also mentioned in the opening session. The right to use time must be a universal right. It should be included in what we might call the new welfare state. The right to the use of time should be enshrined in modern society, in Catalonia, in Spain, and all of Europe. Fourthly, time use policies obviously have to be placed at the heart of public policy. This means that people plus time equals quality of life. Here in Catalonia, as Fabian pointed out, we've been working with civil society since 2014, and we've seen some progress in terms of the cultural change needed. Cultural change can't happen overnight. You can't just press some magic button and suddenly change time use for the citizenry as a whole. Nevertheless, much progress has been made in Catalonia by working with the institutions, universities, and public institutions at universities to set 2025 as our uh, goal. In 2017, we decided that 2025 would be our deadline for compliance with a whole slew of commitments. Commitments decided upon after no end of sectoral meetings, because this is a 360-degree cross-cutting policy. So by 2025, we will be getting rid of that structural time lag created by this 2-hour lag behind the rest of Europe, which means we're working for a formula for time transition that is based on a number of things that we're going to be discussing time and time again over this week. Certainly, time and productivity efficiency for people. Certainly, shared responsibility among genders for sure. Uh, shared responsibility. We can't just keep talking about co-responsibility or shared responsibility. We have to make it happen through co-education, through promotion, but also through laws that will encourage a fairer way of sharing out household work, care for children, and care for people with vulnerable with additional needs, and then create healthy organizations, healthy companies, healthy cities, healthy territories. These are the main points to this cross-cutting plan. One of the elements of progress that we've achieved in the government of Catalonia is the inclusion of time use policies in every single department in the government of Catalonia to ensure that they all start implementing measures to this end. I'll just wind up with a couple of ideas. In this time of difficulty, the measures being adopted to address the pandemic, being imposed to address the pandemic by the government of Catalonia, in a way also constitute a kind of pilot test, an unplanned one, an unintentional one. But a lot of citizens are living with healthier working hours. It's important to note this and observe this in order to move forward in terms of time use reform. And I'll just wind up here. This is the goal of all of the governance organizations in Catalonia, the government of Catalonia, the City Council of Barcelona, the metropolitan area of Barcelona, and the time use Society of Time Use for and so forth. We are all working together to make Barcelona an international hub on time use policy, and this will be achieved paradoxically, ironically, because we're one of the places where time use is most improper in the world. So, um, or inappropriate, rather. So let's turn this into an opportunity to improve and turn Barcelona, Catalonia into an international hub for time use policies. Thank you, Alexis Serra, the director of the Time Use Reform Office at the Government of Catalonia. And now we leave the current sphere of our work, or geographical scope of our work, and we will hear from Joaquín Pérez, Secretary of State for Employment and Social Economy of the Government of Spain. I'm really excited to have him here. We were supposed to meet before the pandemic. The pandemic changed everything. And now at last, we can get together and talk virtually about all sorts of things that we hope the government of Spain will contribute to. First of all, Joaquin, I would like you to give us your balance of the telecommuting regulations. We have followed this whole negotiation with trade and employers unions in the media. So I'd like you to give us your perspective, your take on this. We've heard about a technological leap forward. We also need a cultural leap forward. We're now awaiting a new scenario, a new setting, a new context, which should be a new time use law. I mean, we've seen some connected things, but we're really looking forward to such a bill with an integrated perspective. So, how is that work going? Another question linked to this is the following: is the time ripe for Spain to reach an agreement on this matter? Because we're talking about working hours, but also hours for culture, for sports, for TV, shopping hours, hours for consumers, education hours, school. Mm, How is it going? And I ask you, as I have asked all the others, what silver linings, what positive things is COVID contributing, despite the pain it is causing, to help make change in terms of time use? Well, thank you very much, Fabian, and I would like to really thank the organizers for their invitation. Yes, indeed, the pandemic sort of just crashed its way into our lives, and it's in a way paradoxical that we're considering time uh, as a result or as conditioned by the pandemic. It's really wonderful to be taking part in this session with brilliant people such as the preceding speakers. I have a dual reflection to share with you here. When you talk about your working hours, and we can't think about time if we ignore working hours, we tend to take on a sort of unilateral sort of discourse. Working time prevails over everything else. The rest of the times you need is subject to working time. I mean, Sarabia mentioned the time of cities, but the time for cities is residual relative to working time. You know, we organize our public transport schedules according to regular working hours. Shop opening hours are also dependent on that. So any change in working hours is going to have an impact on everything else. And the discourse on working hours, as you know better than I do, tends to be unilateral. It tends to be imposed. It's something that everything else has to adapt to. Now, you were asking me to reflect upon the implications of this pandemic. The way I see it, this pandemic has really been quite educational for us all because it's made us realize that working hours could be incompatible with living hours. We've had to do something about working hours to preserve hours for caring, other hours for taking care, whatever. We've turned telecommuting into a healthcare instrument. We've sought in every possible way to ensure that those times that those reflexes that we talk about, the presenteeism that Sarah mentioned, could be abolished or set aside. It's as if during the pandemic we placed the time for life at the center and set time for work to the side. Now, I don't know to what extent we can rush to conclusions, but I'm convinced that we have experienced the hugest working hour reduction experiment in history. It's the very first time a reduction in working hours of such caliber has been promoted in a big way. But of course, there's the matter of hours actually worked and hours paid. There's also been a problem with people working crazy hours and so on and so forth. But according to the active population survey, there's been an experience of 20% reduction in working hours. Over 16% of people have become telecommuters. It's a huge, huge experiment, a huge upheaval, and we won't emerge until this also said. We have to bring together all of forced compulsory experience, traumatic experience, if even, but we have to put it together and figure out better ways to organize our lives. The measures adopted by the Ministry of Labor have all contributed to this reduction of working time. The furlough schemes implemented were created in order to reduce the number of hours worked. The paid recoverable leave was a way to work towards health objectives, but by reducing hours. No, there are ways that enable better sharing out of work, not only prioritizing organizational needs, but also prioritizing life needs, the needs for caring and taking care, which are often treated as marginal matters. We also implemented the Me Cuida program, which is something that we tried to promote with the following aim. The idea is that the things that were making uh, work and life compatible, namely the educational system and the uh, paid care workers systems. Uh, well, when those mechanisms stopped working, then we had to adjust shift work and other things, or and bring in flexibility, which is something that's not quite common in our legislation, or to the extent that it is. It's only, flexibility is only mentioned from the perspective of employers rather than from the perspective of the vital needs of workers. And so we've also seized this opportunity to make some progress in terms of more structural sorts of reforms. One of them has already been completed. We're now regulating telecommuting. Well, and working from home, including telecommuting as one component of it. It's been very hard to strike a good balance, but I think we have. Uh, And there are some necessary starting points there. First of all, telecommuting is not a mechanism for work-life balance. There is no work-life balance through telecommuting. When you see pictures of children climbing all over people taking part in remote meetings, that actually shows that telecommuting can really be an enemy of work-life balance because it's a problem because it invades the home.
We also need to provide tools to unplug, which is what Sarah was saying. This kind of telecommuting working hours cannot be endless. Um, because in sometimes there's no distinction between working hours and leisure time. And there's yet another fundamental element, which is to escape from stereotypes and the gender gap. I believe that we need to fight discrimination from that point of view, and it's one of the pillars of the new regulation. And it was a key factor for this law because it ensures that telecommuting does not mean worsening working conditions for some, but rather the opposite. Now, all of these elements must come together and help us move forward in our thought. And how do we juggle all of these different time uses? As Alexis was saying, we need to be co responsible, and this shouldn't be just an empty shell. it should be filled with a real substance, and we should become more and more effective and ensure our work. As Fabian was saying, and the minister, when she spoke before the Congress, now for the Ministry of the Employment, the idea of working on this shared responsibility for time use, which could be used to help us move along with our pending issues with Europe. And I'm referring to the transposition of the directive on work leaves and such. This is something that we should start toying with over the mid-run as part of this social dialogue, and begin to understand that the uh, um, work-related regulations should no longer be cast in stone. We believe that working hours rule over all of other life-related time, and we should understand that this is like a jigsaw puzzle, and we should try to fit everything together because it feeds from one another. There's still a long way to go. There are a lot of things that need to be probably researched, and I believe that initiatives such as this one, as well as the whole Catalan experience that Alexis was recounting about time use, are indeed food for thought for what we plan to do, because we're convinced that working time is an essential tool to set all the other kinds of time in order. And probably what we'll have to do is that time has to be subject to other kinds of pace and rhythm. So working hours will become just one of those rhythms in our lives. And this experience is essential for us. I'm extremely grateful for the invitation that I've received. And I'm here at your entire disposal, Fabian, as well as to all of the other participants that are gently listening to us, despite the fact that from a point of view of time management, I have to say that this wouldn't be the best time during the day right after lunchtime. But anyway, that's a different discussion altogether. Thank you. Great. We will now give the floor to the last speaker of the evening. We spoke from the Spanish perspective, now from the European perspective. We have here with us the representative of the European Commission in Barcelona, Laura Rahola. We know her already. We're not going to ask you, Laura, about the daylight savings time. I haven't asked Joaquín either. This is something that we'll discuss during a different panel this week, because we're speaking about the COVID-related measures and what the different institutions are doing. We see a ray of hope in European institutions and what they stand for in terms of public policies for time use reform and time management policies. So my question would be as follows. Uh, After listening to everything we've been discussing, how does that fit into European priorities? Do you believe that the European Union has made strides during this time to respond to those needs that have been imposed by the COVID crisis, and in general terms as well? Do you think that in the future, can you picture the European Union and its institutions as a tool, as a fundamental tool in transforming national agendas regarding time use? Hello, good evening, and thank you, Fabian. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. Now, given that I represent a European institution, which is the European Commission, I'll try to zoom out of this and to give you a more European perspective and how we've responded to this pandemic so far. This has hit us all from many different points of view. However, I think it also showed us, helped us see ourselves in the mirror of fragility. We've seen how frail human life is, how vulnerable everything that we took for granted in our days is, how our daily life has just toppled and fell through. And we've seen how the European project was also quite fragile. It has happened in previous crises as well. And it's good to own up to this. If we travel back to the beginning of this crisis, the beginning of March, the uh, President of the Commission herself, Ms. von der Leyen, recognized that the European response was not up to par. It was not what we expected. When we were witnessing the first cases in Italy and Spain, one of the first reactions we saw was countries shutting down borders, European leaders criticizing one another, and not sharing enough medical equipment. So we didn't see that kind of solidarity that is supposed to have when we work together as a European Union. So by the same token, when we saw those first reactions, we believe that the European Commission was swift in tackling those reactions and setting in motion a whole list of urgent measures. First, to ensure what we call green corridors and to ensure that healthcare and medical equipment could travel freely country to country. There was a coordinated strategy to repatriate European citizens that had been stranded in different countries. We rendered European funds more flexible very quickly so they could be allocated to the direct fight against COVID-19. Also, the safeguard clause was activated so that public deficit could also be used as part of this urgent reaction to alleviate the brunt of the crisis. Face masks were bought collectively, as you remember, at a time in which they were considered extremely necessary, gloves and other medical equipment. This was purchased collectively by the Commission, and it was done very swiftly. Now, against a crisis of this magnitude, that was not enough. These were just some makeshift measures, but then you need to be ambitious in the kind of response that you could provide. This, which is what the Commission did from the very beginning, and I believe that we were fast-paced at when launching the recovery plan for Europe, which was extraordinary for different reasons, because of the amount of money. This package of extraordinary subsidies were 750,000 euros that could be allocated urgently, even though we needed the final approval of member states. And we urged them to approve of that, but the Commission presented this project with this initial agreement of the member state. So extraordinary because of the high amount of money, but also because for the very first time, the member states decided to engage in this solidarity debt. They decided to take on more debt to work for the others. And why am I saying this? Because I believe it comes to show that the European institutions responded to the crisis in a very different way, the way they did back in the financial crisis, where economic stability was seen as a priority, and how to bring down expenditure. So we were all aware that this was quite a challenge before us, and we all had to chip in order to succeed at overcoming it. I believe that we all need to be, and by we, I don't mean Europe alone, all kinds of institutions need to act as firefighters that try to put out a fire, and they need to do that right away. But at the same time, we need to be architects and rebuild the edifice that toppled. Not the way it was before, as it has been said. We don't want to go back to square one, but we need to provide this building with new materials and security mechanisms to avoid new fires, or if we cannot avoid them, because I'm sure that they will appear eventually, to be better equipped to fight them whenever they turn up. Now, this was the gist of what I wanted to say about how the European institutions reacted, uh, both immediately and also over the long run. And I believe that this will be the case in the future as well. We could speak about specific policies and this whole economic package and how we'll be able to juggle the more urgent needs to the long-term policies that are needed to transform this model. Sustainability, digital transformation, and all of these things that have been brought up already. Regarding European goals, the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, when she initiated her mandate in 2019, even though it sounds like ancient history. It was just 9 months ago when the crisis started, right? So a little bit before that, this commission had started this mandate, and the president, Ursula von der Leyen, established 6 priorities at the beginning of that mandate with 2 main pillars. First, the green transition and the so-called European Green Deal, which was meant to achieve very ambitious environmental goals, such as to become the first continent to achieve climate neutrality. And secondly, we are convinced that Europe can no longer be, or they cannot be just an outsider in this transition, but we need to be an agent of change, and we to seize all of the opportunities that this digital transition will provide us for many reasons. That means investing in artificial intelligence, deploying 5G networks, modernizing administrations. And based on those 2 transitions, I'm sure that many of the ideas that we have bandied about can find their place. Um, as Sarah was saying, we can no longer continue business as usual as if nothing happened. I agree. And the European Commission also believes that we cannot just continue with an economic and productive model such as the one we carry along, thinking that, resources are not finite, are not perishable, and this planet can take on anything we throw at it. We are reacting to this COVID crisis, but we also have this climate change crisis, the crisis that stems from this globalization, as well as the digital transition challenges. So I believe that if there's something we've learned as part of this perfect storm, as someone coined this particular crisis, that comes underpinned with so many other crises. It's not only necessary to repair the damage in the ship, but we also need to reinforce the structure to bolster it and to overcome this and any future pandemic and crisis, and also to mm, sail in the right direction, to set the right course, because we shouldn't be overutilizing resources. We should move towards a more sustainable economy, and from a social point of view, a much fairer society as well. So, as part of those goals that are pursued by the European Commission, the digital transition and the green transition, we can also fit these new ideas about our model and how to manage and organize our time. Great, Laura. Thank you very much. We only have 10 minutes left. We started out with a certain delay. You know that these things happen even for us that are all for time reconciliation. But I would like to give the floor to, well, Sarah and the whole lineup of speakers, if you all want to say anything more. But I'm concerned that uh, anything we do, any action we undertake can be seen as biased, because some of you work in some of those from the point of view of a specific stakeholder or from a perspective of your own institution, whereas I believe it would behoove us to have a more comprehensive vision about this, about any time use policy. And when we link shared responsibility to this profound reform that we need to undertake, well, it concerns me because we have the school timetables, opening hours for shops. We have this daylight and savings time. We have TV shows and their own schedules. We have our central working hours, which have to be a pillar as well. But we have other aspects that need to be legislated on the basis of a social agreement or pact, and also how to educate our citizenship in the future. We're not North Korea. We're not going to take a specific measure saying from now on people are going to have lunch at such and such hour. No, we are a very plural, diverse society, everyone with his or her own time use, but we need to have that broad picture about what's going on. So I would like to have Sarah, Alexis, Joaquin, just a couple minutes each, based on this time use pact and the time use reform pact, and that forthcoming time use act in Madrid and also all across Spain. Um, um, to what degree do you pin your hopes on that? Is it possible? Do you think that we'll achieve it in the future? Sarah, well, I agree that unless everyone is on board, we won't be able to achieve anything. I believe that what we mentioned about this time use pact is quite telling about that need. We need to be efficient. That involves work and having more compact working hours so that while you're working, you can be effective and therefore you're released from work once you're done with that. People speak about healthy time, and that means being able to sleep, to have a rest during night, to be able to unplug from work, and also a certain balance between men and women, so there are no differences. So healthy, sustainable, efficient. That impinges on all of our spheres in life. That's why it requires an integrated viewpoint. You were asking about our hopes. Well, I believe that those of us with a public position, we shouldn't lose hope. We shouldn't throw in the towel, despite the fact that years go by and we continue to uh, defend things that are self-explanatory for us, but people don't really realize that are needed. I think that our system is very productive and it's not people centered. That is why people are so reluctant from all walks of life. We were speaking about this earlier, and our colleague from the European Commission as well, how to unplug from technology. Well, there are a lot of company directors that do not want that to happen, and they want to keep their employees tracked all the time. And it's part and parcel of this problem. First, top management, let's say the high directors in executives in any company, it is indispensable to show all top management positions in Catalonia and Spain, because this is a Spanish debate. All the graphs, the data we have showing that we have the longest working hours, the most rigid working hours in Europe, but our productivity is some of the lowest in the continent. If you're a public manager and on your wall, instead of having personal pictures of your family, you show those data, they will realize something's wrong. There's something that we are not doing properly. We cannot be working such long hours and not being productive at all. There's something utterly wrong. So that reluctance that we're witnessing in top management positions, but also middle managers, they are the ones who need to implement changes. And that is fundamental, which is why we need to work on communicating, awareness raising, and training people within organizations. On top of everything we're doing for society at large, because then, well, I'm more hopeful, let's say, because people are coming to terms with this idea. Whereas organizations, that means businesses, different industries, administrations, obviously as well, there's a lot to be done there because people are very reluctant to changing anything about the system, which is where we have been trained and where we live.
I wanted to say, Fabian. So, uh, well, what I just wanted to say is that neuroscience is here to stay. It's not just about sociology and the active population survey. It's also, neuroscience that's telling us about this. That's something that's been a contribution, Alexis, from the Catalan Pact. Absolutely. And I would also like to emphasize what Sarah was saying about time use policies as comprehensive, comprehensive, integrated policies. If they're not comprehensive and integrated, they're just not time use policies. The whole point in the Pact for Time Reform time use reform, I mean, everything was covered. It was, shopping hours, officialdom, uh, audiovisual programming, healthcare, telecommuting, certainly, education. So all of it is included. Now, that's one thing. You know, reaching agreements on specifics is another. I mean, Catalonia has its sphere of jurisdiction to the extent that it can legislate on matters that affect time use policies. It does. For instance, in terms of retail hours, there are certain limitations in our legislation for retail hours. And in this pandemic, we're experiencing this as something that benefits not only consumers, but also people who have small shops, neighborhood shops, and who also need more time for their families. I would just like to end my speech by saying, well, we have people from different institutions here, including Joaquin from the Spanish Ministry of Labor. And I just want to say that because we have to consider the work done not only by civil society in Catalonia, which has been working very hard since 2014 to make these working hours or these hours more decent ones, but we also have officialdom on board. The government of Catalonia has come on board and has been working on that. And I'd also like to emphasize what you, Joaquin, raised, which is well, working hours. I mean, and that, of course, is where there's the most um, backlash. I remember it wasn't a poster, it was a diagram in some media outlet. The source of the data was Eurostat, and it showed time allocation in Spain compared to France, Italy, Sweden, and Germany. When you see time use allocation for Spain as a whole, and you can see that, we're talking, but we're ending work between 7 and 8 p.m. Well, that's really harmful. So we have to seize the opportunity of social dialogue with the employers' unions, the trade unions, and well, the government of Spain, which has the um, jurisdiction over this matter. Well, we have to work together to see if we can do something about this fact that we leave work between 7 and 8 p.m., perhaps by reducing midday meal time, which is so long that, well, we only have it here, in Catalonia and in the rest of Spain. Nobody else has that kind of long meal times. So we need a cross-cutting perspective. We need to address all uses of time, definitely, but we particularly need to emphasize the persistent issue that despite legislation for flexible working hours and despite legislation to support telecommuting, there are all sorts of other things that come into play. So we need a really cross-cutting perspective. And I would like to encourage the government of Spain to set down to work, and we, from our perspective, will do as much as we can to contribute to that work. So as you can see, Joaquin, this is the meeting we were supposed to have. We're having it, except that we're having it in public, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So maybe, Joaquin, you can wind up addressing this idea of the integrated, comprehensive nature of public policy. I mean, we carried out a study similar to one carried out in Valencia. The conclusion was that we didn't have that the Catalan government doesn't have the jurisdiction for it, and also that some kind of general compact should be reached. So we have to go back to the working hours of our grandparents. That's one thing. And secondly, we need certain changes that require Spain wide legislation, which can only be done in the Parliament of Spain. And so, one of our challenges for this week for us is to get you to take on the challenge, to take it up. So, what do you think? Okay, well, taking up the challenge. And of course, the Ministry of Labor is absolutely willing to work together with you on these matters, which, as all of you have said, are, you know, a comprehensive policy, but where working hours play a central role. If we go back to the start of what I said when I talked about an excessively unilateral perspective, I think if we start uh, changing working hours, we will actually have an impact on all of the other times that revolve around working time. We need to take on board all of the existing experience on this matter. And of course, when we look at time, I mean, this is it's especially necessary to look at time uses from a territorial perspective. If you look at Spain, we have very different, even sunrise hours between the Cape of Creus and in the east and Fisterra in the west. I mean, there's a huge difference. So this is, you know, the change in time use is a cultural change. It's the greatest cultural change, but I do feel some hope because look at what has happened in this time of disruption that we're experiencing. We are undergoing a major cultural change, and the present situation has led to considerable changes and the willingness to accept them. As Sarah and Alexis pointed out, it is business management in it is business management, business managers that need to start to understand that productivity is not tied to FaceTime, to presenteeism. I mean, we really need to learn this and we need to go deeper into this point. But beyond that, there's the matter of technological progress. The increased productivity achieved through technological progress has to be a way to release time for other uses, for uses perhaps different from the ones that usually structure our time. So maybe we need to link technological progress to its impact on the time devoted by people to their work. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with these thoughts from somebody working in a ministry that is all about work. We also need to underpin the idea of decent work. I mean, a lot of the mechanisms that we have to do with the precariousness of employment. And the problems that have to do with time come from the powerlessness of people who have to put up with a lot of overtime and unpaid overtime even. I mean, this is simply because too many people have jobs that do not provide enough safeguards to ensure that it's really, limited in time and that it's compatible with life. I don't want to end on a negative note, however, quite the contrary. In this major revolution in time created by the pandemic, because one way or another, the pandemic has been revolutionary, we need to find some changes that are better and work better so that our life pace is more compatible with life. Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. This is the end of the third session of the opening day. Tomorrow, of the launch, tomorrow we'll be focusing on local time use policies. We'll start with a session on cities as key players to promote time use policies. Then at 10:30, we will have a meeting of Catalan municipalities for time use reform. It'll be a summit of municipalities. At 3 p.m., we'll be talking about ICT and time use of teenagers and young people. And at 4 p.m., we will have the presentation of some information about screen time and family life. So the morning will be for local governance. The afternoon will be for children, teenagers, and young people who experience the impact of all this brutally, which means that we really have to address the way families are tackling screen use time and family time. Thank you very much, all of you. I'd like to thank you, Joaquín, Laura, Sara, Alexis. Thanks to the over 100 people who have been following us, and see you tomorrow at Time Use Week. Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you very much.